In the breathing dark of his quiet office, Kinderman brooded above his desk. He adjusted the desk lamp beam a fraction. Below him were records, transcripts, exhibits, police files, crime lab reports, scribbled notes. In a pensive mood, he had carefully fashioned them into a collage in the shape of a rose, as if to belie the ugly conclusion to which they had led him, that he could not accept. Engstrom was innocent. At the time of Dennings's death, he had been visiting his daughter, supplying her with money for the purchase of drugs. He had lied about his whereabouts that night in order to protect her and to shield her mother, who believed Elvira to be dead and past all harm and degradation. It was not from Carl that Kinderman had learned this. On the night of their encounter in Elvira's hallway, the houseman had kept obdurately silent. It was only when Kinderman apprised the daughter of her father's involvement in the Dennings case that she volunteered the truth. There were witnesses to confirm it. Engstrom was innocent. Innocent and silent concerning events that involved the MacNeils. Kinderman frowned at the collage. Something was wrong with the composition. He shifted a petal point, the corner of a deposition, a trifle lower and to the right. Roses. Elvira. He had warned her grimly that failure to check herself into a clinic within 2 weeks would result in his dogging her trail with warrants until he had evidence to effect her arrest. Yet he did not believe she would go. There were times when he stared at the law unblinkingly as he would the noonday sun in the hope it would temporarily blind him while some quarry made its escape. Engstrom was innocent. What remained? Gently wheezing, the detective shifted his weight and, closing his eyes, he imagined he was soaking in a sudsy hot bath. Mental closeout sale, he bannered at himself, moving to new conclusions. Everything must go. Then, positively, he added sternly, and with that the detective opened his eyes and examined afresh the bewildering data. Item. The death of director Burke Dennings seemed somehow linked to the desecrations at Holy Trinity. Both involved witchcraft and the unknown desecrator could easily be Dennings's murderer. Item. An expert on witchcraft, a Jesuit priest, had been seen making visits to the home of the MacNeils. Item. The typewritten sheet of paper containing the text of the blasphemous altar card discovered at Holy Trinity had been checked for latent fingerprints. Impressions had been found on both sides. Some had been made by Damien Karras. But still another set had been found that, from their size, were adjudged to be those of a person with very small hands, quite possibly a child. Item. The typing on the altar card had been analyzed and compared with the typed impressions on the unfinished letter that Sharon Spencer had pulled from her typewriter, crumpled up and tossed at a waste paper basket, missing it, while Kinderman had been questioning Chris. He had picked it up and smuggled it out of the house. The typing on this letter and the typing on the altar card sheet had been done on the same machine. According to the report, however, the touch of the typists differed. The person who had typed the blasphemous text had a touch far heavier than Sharon Spencer's. Since the typing of the former, moreover, had not been hunt and peck, but skillfully accomplished, it suggested that the unknown typist of the altar card text was a person of extraordinary strength. Item. Burke Dennings, if his death was not an accident, had been killed by a person of extraordinary strength. Item. Engstrom was no longer a suspect. Item. A check of domestic airline reservations disclosed that Chris MacNeil had taken her daughter to Dayton, Ohio. Kinderman had known that the daughter was ill and was being taken to a clinic. But the clinic in Dayton would have to be Barringer. Kinderman had checked and the clinic confirmed that the daughter had been in for observation. Though the clinic refused to state the nature of the illness, it was obviously a serious mental disorder. Item. Serious mental disorders at times caused extraordinary strength. Kinderman sighed, closed his eyes and shook his head. He was back to the same conclusion. Then he opened his eyes and stared at the center of the paper rose, a faded old copy of a national news magazine. On the cover were Chris and Regan. He studied the daughter, the sweet, freckled face and the ribbon ponytails, the missing front tooth in the grin. He looked out a window into darkness, where a drizzling rain had begun to fall. He went down to the garage, got into the unmarked black sedan and then drove through rain-slick, shining streets to Georgetown, where he parked on the eastern side of Prospect Street and for minutes sat silently staring up at Regan's window. Should he knock at the door and demand to see her? Lowering his head, he rubbed at his brow. William F. Kinderman, you are sick. He thought. You are ill. Go home. Take medicine. Sleep. Get better. He looked up at the window again and ruefully shook his head. To this place had his haunted logic led him? He shifted his gaze as a cab pulled up to the house. He started his engine and turned on the windshield wipers in time to see a tall old man stepping out of the cab. He paid the driver, then turned and stood motionless under a misty street lamp's glow, staring up at a window of the house like a melancholy traveler frozen in time. As the cab pulled away and rounded the corner of 36th Street, Kinderman quickly pulled out to follow. As he turned the corner, he blinked his headlights, signaling the taxi to stop. While inside the MacNeil house at that moment, Karras and Carl were pinning Regan's emaciated arms while Sharon injected her with Librium, bringing the total amount injected in the last 2 hours to 400 milligrams. A dosage, Karras knew, that was staggering. But after a lull of many hours, the demonic personality had awakened in a fit of fury so frenzied that Regan's debilitated system could not for very long endure it. Karras was exhausted. After his visit to the Chancery office that morning, he returned to the house to tell Chris what had happened, and after setting up an intravenous feeding for Regan, he'd gone back to his room in the Jesuit residence hall, where he fell face down and limp onto his bed and instantly into a profound and deep sleep. But after barely 2 hours, the strident ringing of his telephone had wrenched him awake. Sharon. Regan was still unconscious and her pulse had been gradually slipping lower. Karras had then rushed to the house with his medical bag and pinched Regan's Achilles tendon, looking for reaction to pain. There was none. He pressed down hard on one of her fingernails. Again, there was no reaction. Karras grew alarmed. Though he knew that in hysteria and in certain states of trance there was sometimes an insensitivity to pain, he now feared coma, a state from which Regan might so very easily slip into death. He checked her blood pressure, 90/60, then her pulse rate, 60. He had waited in the room then, and checked her again every 15 minutes for an hour and a half before he was satisfied that both her blood pressure and pulse rate had stabilized, meaning Regan was not in shock but rather in a state of stupor. Sharon was instructed to continue to check Regan's pulse every hour. Then Karras had returned to his room and his sleep. But now again a ringing telephone awakened him. The Exorcist, the Chancery office told him, would be Lancaster Merrin, with Karras to assist. The news had stunned him. Merrin, the philosopher paleontologist, the soaring, staggering intellect. His books had stirred ferment in the church, for they interpreted his faith in terms of matter that was still evolving and destined to be spirit that at the end of time would join with Christ, the omega point. Karras had immediately telephoned Chris to give her the news, but found that she'd heard from the bishop directly that Merrin would arrive the next day. I told the bishop he could stay at the house, Chris said. It'll just be a day or so, won't it? Before answering, Karras had paused, then said quietly, I don't know. And then, pausing again, he said, you mustn't expect too much. If it works, you mean, Chris had answered. Her tone had been subdued. I didn't mean to imply that it wouldn't, the priest reassured her. I just meant that it might take time. How long? It varies. Karras knew that an exorcism could take weeks, even months. Knew that frequently it failed altogether. He expected the latter. Expected that the burden, barring cure through suggestion, would fall once again, and at the last, upon him. It can take a few days or weeks, he'd then told her, and she'd answered him numbly, how long has she got, Father Karras? When he'd hung up the phone, he'd felt heavy, tormented. Stretched out on his bed, he thought of Merrin. Merrin. An excitement and a hope had seeped into him, although a sinking disquiet had followed. He himself had been the natural choice for exorcist, and yet the bishop had passed him over. Why? Because Merrin had done this before. As he'd closed his eyes, he'd recalled that exorcists were selected on the basis of piety and high moral qualities. That a passage in the Gospel of Matthew related that Christ, when asked by his disciples the cause of their failure in an effort at exorcism, had answered, because of your little faith. The provincial had known about his problem, as had also Tom Birmingham, the Georgetown president. Had either of them mentioned it to the bishop? Here Karras had turned over on his bed, despondent, feeling somehow unworthy, incompetent, rejected. It stung. Unreasonably, it stung. Then, finally, sleep flowed into his emptiness, filling in the niches and cracks in his heart. Then again the waking ring of his telephone, Chris calling to inform him of Regan's sudden frenzy. Back at the house, he checked Regan's pulse. It was strong. He gave her Librium, then gave it again. And again. Finally, he made his way to the kitchen, slumping down at the breakfast table with Chris. She was reading a book, one of Merrin's that she'd ordered delivered to the house. Way over my head, she told Karras softly, and yet she looked touched and deeply moved. But there's some of it so beautiful, so great. She flipped back through pages to a passage she had marked, and handed the book across the table to Karras. Here, take a look. Ever read it? I dunno. Let me see. Karras took the book and began to read. We have familiar experience of the order, the constancy, the perpetual renovation of the material world which surrounds us. Frail and transitory as is every part of it, restless and migratory as are its elements, still it abides. It is bound together by a law of permanence, and though it is ever dying, it is ever coming to life again. Dissolution does but give birth to fresh modes of organization, and one death is the parent of 1,000 lives. Each hour, as it comes, is but a testimony how fleeting, yet how secure, how certain, is the great whole. It is like an image on the waters, which is ever the same, though the waters ever flow. The sun sinks to rise again. The day is swallowed up in the gloom of night, to be born out of it, as fresh as if it had never been quenched. Spring passes into summer, and through summer and autumn into winter, only the more surely, by its own ultimate return, to triumph over that grave towards which it resolutely hastened from its first hour. We mourn the blossoms of May because they are to wither, but we know that May is one day to have its revenge upon November, by the revolution of that solemn circle which never stops, which teaches us in our height of hope, ever to be sober, and in our depth of desolation, never to despair. Yes, it's beautiful, Karras said softly, and as he poured a cup of coffee for himself, the raging of the demon from upstairs grew louder. Bastard, scum, pious hypocrite. She used to put a rose on my plate, in the morning, before I'd go to work, Chris said distantly. Karras looked up with a question in his eyes, and Chris answered it. Regan, she told him. She looked down. Yeah, that's right. I forget. Forget what? I forget that you've never met her. She blew her nose and dabbed at her eyes. Want some brandy in that coffee? Thanks, no. Coffee's flat, Chris whispered tremulously. I think I will get some brandy. Excuse me. She stood up and left the kitchen. Karras sat alone and sipped bleakly at his coffee. He felt warm in the sweater that he wore beneath his cassock, felt weak in his failure to have given Chris comfort. Then a memory of childhood shimmered up sadly, a memory of Reggie, his mongrel dog, growing skeletal and dazed in a box in a run-down tenement apartment. Reggie shivering with fever and vomiting while Karras tried covering him with towels, tried to make him drink warm milk, until a neighbor came by, looked at Reggie and, shaking his head, said, "Your dog has distemper. He needed shots right away." Then dismissal from school one afternoon, to the street, in columns of twos to the corner. His mother there to meet him, unexpected, looking sad, and then pressing a shiny $50 piece into his hand. Elation, so much money. Then her voice, soft and tender, Reggie die. He looked down at the steaming, bitter blackness in his cup and felt his hands bare of comfort or of cure. Pious bastard. The demon. Still raging. Your dog needed shots right away. Karras immediately got up and returned to Regan's bedroom, where he held her while Sharon administered a Librium injection that brought the total dosage up to 500 milligrams. As Sharon swabbed the needle puncture, preparing to slap a band-aid onto it, Karras was staring down at Regan in puzzlement, for the frenzied obscenities spewing from her mouth seemed directed at no one in the room, but rather at someone unseen, or not present. He dismissed it. I'll be back, he told Sharon. Concerned about Chris, he went down to the kitchen, where again he found her sitting alone at the table. She was pouring brandy into her coffee. Are you sure you wouldn't like some, Father? She asked him. Shaking his head, he came over to the table, where he sat down wearily and lowered his face into his hands on propped elbows, heard the porcelain clicks of a spoon stirring coffee. Have you talked to her father? He asked. Yes, he called, Chris said. He wanted to talk to Rags. And what did you tell him? I told him she was out at a party.